Welcome, everybody, and thanks for being here for discussing a big and important question, which is what will sustainable and equitable farming systems look like in 2050? And we have some great speakers here to discuss this with us tonight. Could you come up here briefly? That I want to briefly introduce. So we have Hannah Wittman, who is a professor at UBC. She's the director of the UBC farm and professor of land and food systems and a sociologist by training, by background. Then we have here Urs Niggli, who has been for almost 30 years the director of FIBEL, which is the Research Institute of Organic Agriculture here in Switzerland. That is one of the really important drivers and actors in the organic movement and in organic research. Then we have here Patricio Grassini, who's a professor of agronomy at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And next to him we have Allison Thomson, who will provide a more applied perspective. She was a crop modeler at the University of Maryland, but is now the science director of Field to Market, a nonprofit, an American nonprofit that is trying to bring sustainable farming practices to farms. So the format of the session will be that each of them will give a flash talk of 5 minutes, followed by a discussion round. And in the discussion round, we will discuss some questions that we have prepared, but then we will also open up the discussion to everyone, to the audience. Yeah, awesome. So very glad these speakers are here, very glad you are here, and I'm looking forward to hearing some hopefully provocative and controversial thoughts about what our farming systems should be look like in 2050. And let's start with Hannah. She will give the first flash talk on her perspective on this question.
All right.
Does this work?
This is fine.
Yeah.
Thank you, Verena, and thank you, Navin, for inviting me to be part of this. I'm new to the GLP community, so this is kind of fun to talk to a different group of people. I'm a rural sociologist by training, and I've spent the last, actually 20 years working on the ground with small-scale and diversified farmers in Latin America, in Brazil, in the Philippines, in Canada, in the United States, and in various other countries across the world. And I've learned quite a bit from this engagement, both about the challenges to survival for small-scale and diversified farms, but also about the potential that they have to approach a different way of farming that can, as they say, feed the world and cool the planet. So the farmers that I work with are part of an international network called the Via Campesina, which brings together indigenous peoples, landless farmers, small-scale farmers, rural women, landless workers, and other kinds of workers who are all kind of in their own way and in their own countries working to challenge what they call a corporate food system, which has been taking their land and their livelihoods. And so they came up in the 1990s with a new way of thinking about food security, and they called it food sovereignty. It's a rights-based approach that looks at the abilities and the capabilities and the rights of local people to have control over their food and resources. So we have spent quite a bit of time trying to say, well, what does that actually look like on the ground, and what are the challenges and barriers to achieving it? And for kind of an introduction, we can say it's based on 3 broad principles. A principle of distributive justice, so who has what? How is that decided? A principle of ecological sustainability. So the Via Campesina was very concerned about many of the negative environmental impacts that they saw in their communities and landscapes that had developed since the Green Revolution. Many of them used Green Revolution technologies and have struggled both for their livelihood survival and looking at their ecological context. And so bringing ecological principles back into food security was a big part of their campaign. And then finally, procedural justice. So how are decisions made about resource use? How are decisions made about land tenure, about food policy, and about the kinds of institutions and infrastructures that would foster a sustainable food future? So we call this the equity principle, the ecology principle, and the empowerment principle. How do we bring these together to create a different food system? The food sovereignty movement has been on the forefront of what we call the agroecological movement. So the kind of farming that they propose and are trying to implement, and this kind of farming is now reaching discussions at the FAO, it's reaching discussions in lots of research institutions. We even at one point had an undergraduate major in agroecology at UBC. And it's based on the idea of agroecological intensification. So growing more on less land is still a principle of agroecological intensification, but it's based on a bunch of additional principles. So diversity, intercropping, nutrient cycling, reducing external input intensity. The social and political ecology piece of agroecology is really important. How are decisions made and how is power distributed throughout the agroecological system in the household, so looking at gender, looking at labor issues, in the community, looking at how resource sharing happens across a community and across a landscape, and then working back up to institutional inputs like ministries of agriculture. How are they functioning and who are they serving? So I only have a few minutes, so I'm going to move on to talk just a tiny bit about some research that we're doing, and I'm happy to talk about this later. So we look at the policy infrastructure around the agroecological transition, and this is a figure from one of our papers that we worked on in Brazil, where we're looking at a number of policies that are aimed to support agroecological transition across Brazil. And so we're going into communities who are participating in institutional procurement, who are participating in agroecological campaigns, and saying, well, how is this working? We're looking at communities who are transitioning to organic agriculture, looking at participatory certification. And so what we're looking at is the broader policy context. We're looking at structural constraints. So what are the institutional barriers and or opportunities that would enable such a transition? We're looking at what resources farmers have themselves. So what is their situation of agency or of autonomy or of empowerment? And then we're working with a group of soil scientists and ecologists to look really closely at the agroecological principles at the farm level. And all of this helps us to understand, well, what is the current level of agroecological transition, and then what are the next steps to get towards the future? So this is just an example of some of the things that we measure in our group. We look at a broad range of indicators from income to dietary diversity to agrobiodiversity. We can talk about the challenges of measuring things like this across very diversified landscapes and communities. That's one of the things that we're actually working really hard on, is how do we accurately measure these really context-specific dynamics. And so I'm happy to chat more about that. And then try to put those into what we call institutional narratives. So what are the drivers of a transition to get to the ultimate goal that we all care about, which is the food system resilience to global change. So I'll leave you there. We just celebrated the International Day of Peasant Struggle, which happens every year on April 17th. So I encourage you to get organized on that day in your universities to recognize the contributions of small-scale peasant producers across the world to global change. And thank you.
Sollen wir es am Hemd festmachen, oder?
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to give that speech. I will talk a little bit about different agroecology-based farming systems. Obviously, we have one problem or a key challenge, which is the trade-off between productivity and sustainability, especially between environmental sustainability, but obviously also economic sustainability, because almost all farmers worldwide have lost money by producing food in the last 20, 30 years. And it is well described, this trade-off, by the publication of Pablo Titonel. So looking at the figure of organic yields, meaning organic productivity, and conventional yields, we see that conventional yields are, or organic yields are about 80% of conventional ones. And this is not only true for organic, this is true for every sustainability approach you can imagine. I have here listed a few ones: agroecology, ecological intensification, sustainable intensification, and somewhere I put organic. it's not so well defined where to put it, but I put it. And we see that, for instance, in Switzerland, with IPM, Integrated Pest Management, which uses almost all technologies available for farmers, we have considerably lower yields than with conventional farming, where farmers maximize yield. So this is true not only for organic, it's true for every endeavor to become much more sustainable. We know from a lot of data, and this is only one we published ourselves from our long-term comparison trial, which was published in Science. It is, meanwhile, a 40-year trial comparing different farming systems. So you see that, for instance, organic is tremendously better in terms of environmental or ecological qualities. But the main deficit is also here, yields minus 20%. So if we want to achieve a higher environmental sustainability, organic would be a brilliant strategy. And the problem remains, do we create enough productivity? And we checked that in our publication, in our modeling, in Nature Communication. So you see, if we go towards organic 10, 20, 40, 50, 60, 100%, you see that we end up in the red zone, meaning that we need much more arable land. So 33% there, 100% organic, 33% means 33% arable land, which has to be plowed. And this is a tremendous climate CO2 bomb into the air. And, but we can also feed the world organically when we reduce food waste and when we reduce the amount of feed stuff produced on arable crops. So you see, solutions can only be made in looking at nutrition and food system, not only at production systems. So we always are in that dimension, that the transformation of natural resources towards yield. This is the same site-specific for every farming system, but then the transformation of short and long-acting anthropogenic measures, there the different farming systems vary considerably. And here we have the productivity in our hands, or the farmer has it in our hands. And we are always in the trade-off between yield, between acquired soil fertility, acquired by the farmer, and also ecosystem services. And which one is the best one? The conventional, the IPM, the agroecology, organic agriculture system, this cannot be yet decided. And we see that we have to look at the management, and we have to use the management options. And so for me it is clear that the most important resource is the human brain, which is pleasantly reproducible, meaning that we have to know to use all knowledge available. And that's why sometimes I distance myself from the organic movement, because we are much too conservative. So we need to design systems. We need to use soil fertility. This is traditional knowledge. But we also need modern technologies like all the regulation mechanisms available in nature, and we also need to use high-tech. So the combination is using the best knowledge available from traditional farmers and nature and high-tech. And so we will find for sure a solution.
Maybe. Can you hear me?
No, you need to use it for
okay.
recording, I think.
All right.
How this works.
Thank you. All right, well, good afternoon. Hopefully, in my keynote presentation yesterday and in the debate this morning, I convinced many of you about the challenge of increasing crop production on existing cropland area as a way to also mitigate climate change. Remember that 30% or 20% of the emissions come from land use change. So we better try to fit this war on existing cropland area. Now, the timeline is 30 years. So we don't want to gamble, right? We want to go for those horses that have the best odds for winning the race. Now, setting priorities means to invest money. So I want you to think as if this is money from your pockets, okay? Which makes a big difference. So here I basically plot in this figure many different solutions that have been proposed to the issue of sustainable intensification, and what's the associated probability of success, and what's the likely time for impact. And remember, we don't want to gamble. We want to go for proven technologies that can increase yields or reduce environmental footprint. And we want to use technologies that exist and that can be applied in the next 30 years. So you can see that there are many good ideas, like, for example, increasing nitrogen fixation, re-engineering photosynthesis, so we can double yields. But the question is, when is that going to happen? Okay? Do we want to invest all our money into things for which the time horizon may be 100 years or 50? Probably not. So setting priorities means to try to invest in those things that you think they're going to give you the greatest return to your investment. So if I have to bet here, I will go for proven technologies that it has shown in the past to work at increasing yields and reducing the environmental footprint. Specifically, closing yield gaps or increasing yields where we know that there are large gaps, or reduce the environmental footprint where we know that the footprint is large. Now, then we need to bring all this into us. I mean, if we're thinking about the system of the future, let's be serious, okay? How do we, I mean, if we have to go to the field in 50 years, measure things, and tell somebody if that system is sustainable, which set of metrics, which sets of indicators are we going to use to evaluate if a system is sustainable or not? So here I put my own thoughts about what would be, for me, in my own very peculiar way of the war, a sustainable crop farming system by year 2050. Will be, and by the way, I'm totally agnostic about what is the set of technologies or ideologies that will take us there, as long as these systems promote high yields, so that farmer yields average around 70 to 80% of yield potential. Systems that promote lower yields and high food prices are out of the game, from my own very own perspective. Because by the end of the day, that will only increase land expansion. So if we're trying to also mitigate climate change, that doesn't seem to be a very smart strategy. We also want to intensify by also reducing the environmental footprint. So we need to be very explicit that as we increase yields, we also need to reduce our for example, nitrogen balance. And if we want to be realistic here, we can set a target of reducing our, or increasing our water, nitrogen, and energy efficiencies by 50%. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions and soil erosion by the same magnitude. Make sure that all farmers rely on integrated pest management. And finally, if one day we have good standards or thresholds for biodiversity, then it will be also good to meet those standards, which yet has to be determined. One of the problems is that our rate of discovering new technologies, new managements, that help us to increase yields and reduce environmental footprint goes very slow. And one of the problems is that the way we do research on the field is very outdated. We go out to our backyard, we try different things, we measure yields, and then after many years, after many sites, we say, okay, this is what you should do on your field. This process is very slow, it's very inefficient, and perhaps more important, sometimes it's not farmer-driven, it's not demand-driven. We are going to the field thinking on testing something that we believe is going to be useful for the farmer, to then realize after 10 years that it doesn't work. So this has to change, and we believe that along those lines, using farmers' data can help us to better strategize how to do research and how to be more impactful. Just imagine if for all major bread baskets in the world, we collect management information from every single field so we know what the best farmers in each major bread basket in the world are doing, and we try to amplify that by recommending those suites of management practices that increase yields and reduce the environmental footprint together. And this is my vision for the future. Fields that report information about yields management so that they can benchmark their performance against the neighbors, and at the same time, an almost real-time discovery of what are the management practices that leads to both higher yields and higher efficiencies together. Thank you. Sorry.
Well, I'll just hold it, probably. All right. Thank you, Patricio. So I was introduced a little bit. So my organization is called Field to Market, which you probably haven't heard unless you're in the U.S. agriculture space in some way. We are a nonprofit organization. We're a multi-stakeholder organization, though, working with the full commodity crop supply chain in the U.S. on a sustainability program. So everybody from the multinational food companies down to local NGO stakeholder groups and everyone in between, to try and find a common way to talk about sustainability. And it actually is very similar to that almost last slide that Patricio showed about increasing efficiency. And anyway, so great to see that. But what I wanted to talk about was something different. I'm going to take us below ground because I feel like this is something that often doesn't, soils don't often surface themselves, no pun intended, at the land conferences. And I thought in this topic in particular, this is something of almost of a revolution or a movement that's happening in U.S. agriculture. And I thought that would be helpful to talk about, which is what type of farming systems? This is the question that was posed. And my position here is that the farming systems that support soil health are the ones that are going to be providing sufficient nutritious food in 2050 and beyond. Soil is a finite resource. Soil health practices are those that preserve and rebuild soil for long-term productivity. And you could talk about organic, regenerative, conventional, integrative. There are more terms for agriculture. This applies to all of them. It's neutral as to like how you do it. I think it applies equally to agroforestry versus row crops and all of that in between. The same principles apply. And what it is defined as, soil health, is the continued capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. And so for those of you that are not soil scientists, as a history of this, I came to Field to Market and started working with actual farmers about 5 years ago. Prior to that, I'd worked with a lot of soil scientists, and they were all identified as physics, chemistry, biology. They had their thing that they focused on, and the community as a whole was siloed there, and I'd never heard anybody use the term soil health in a science conference ever until I came to be working with farmers. And what that meant in terms of guidance to farmers from scientists is they get information on that. Soil physics is kind of just how much can I take out on the field today? Can I go out and operate or not? And then soil chemistry is just entirely nutrients. What amendments do I need to add to produce a crop? And then soil biology is like, well, not really, farmers aren't really thinking about that, as there wasn't really guidance coming from that community for them. So soil health is integrating all of these together, physical, chemical, biological, into a full system. So you're looking at a supportive ecosystem in terms of the structure and the nutrients within that. So what does it mean? Supporting the below ground ecosystem. So what it does is it turns, I've heard throw around some of these things I've heard, but it turns farmers into also ranchers, right? So they're ranching this below ground ecosystem. They're responsible for livestock all of a sudden. And they have to provide them, right? Food, air, water, shelter. That's what living things need. And so how do you manage your soil to provide those things to all the microbiome organisms and other organisms down there? So improving the physical structure, providing living root systems. And so what farmers do, and so these are the sort of principles of what farmers are doing to improve soil health. You can interpret them into specific practices based on your system, right? Minimizing soil disturbance, improving residue management, leaving residue on the field, integrating livestock and grazing into the system, having a continuous living cover rotation planned. So those practices can be done in any kind of system. So what makes this sustainable? 4 things here. 1, production. Research is actually still catching up to the farmers on this. The farmers have kind of taken it and run with it, and there's been a lot of philanthropic investment in this. So there's a lot happening, and the research is still going on, but so far it appears that yields can be maintained or increased under using these soil health practices. There's also this potential for additional products. When you're adding cover crops, sometimes you can harvest those for forage, have animals graze them, or potentially even produce a second crop with your cover crop. Resiliency, so soils become more sponge-like when they have a better structure to them and more organic matter. Their water holding capacity improves, so you're more resilient to both floods and drought. So this little image just shows, after a heavy rain, one side, it's infiltrating well into the soil, available to all microorganisms under there. I'll finish in just 1 second, Navin. And the other side, you can see, crops don't like water ponding like that, so you can see that as an issue. Mitigation, building carbon. You're adding organic material. This is 1% versus 5% organic matter in the same soil type just by management. And then finally, the reason I most think this is sustainable is that farmers are getting excited about it, and they're almost sometimes even talking about it in spiritual terms, as this sort of reaffirms their commitment and their need to be stewards of the land and that type of thing. So it really resonates with them. And it also returns a measure of agency. Like, we're working with these commodity farmers who've been sort of stuck in the system for several decades of plant this seed, you apply these products. If you have a problem, you apply this product. And they don't have any real control over that. It's all stuff they have to go buy. This gives them something they can really control and manage, and they seem to really appreciate having that sense of agency with the soil health movement. So that's what I have. Thanks.
Hello? Yes, awesome. Perfect. Great. So thank you very much for this, for these first thoughts from all of you. And we thought that we wanted to start this discussion with a short statement from all of you about what does, in your view, your opinion, what is the biggest problem with current farming systems? And let's start with you, Patricio.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Wow, where to start? Yes, the biggest one is that we are asking farmers to do a lot these days, not only to produce food, but also to take care of the environment, the biodiversity, even the social justice, even gender issues, everything. And which is good. I mean, it's fair to ask them for more. At the same time, it will be fair to give them thresholds for those things. Like to tell them, well, this is the reference point where you should be, so that farmers can use that as a sort of a benchmark to evaluate where they are, and eventually to measure progress toward that optimal situation. So for me, one of the biggest problems that I perceive is that we are asking for a lot, but we are not providing farmers with realistic benchmarks for productivity, environmental footprint, diversity, and so forth.
All right, I'll build a little on that. So again, my focus is with the commodity farmers, so big, large-scale farmers in the U.S. So it's probably different in different regions of the world. But one thing that I see as a big challenge facing the whole agricultural industry is the disconnects. We have now the situation where in the U.S. and in other developed countries, people are further and further removed from the land, right? The number of people who have any direct experience with farming, even through like the previous generation, is dwindling. So you have less and less direct experience of what it is to farm. And on top of that, you have I don't know if fads, but just alarmism and things, popping up of we need to ban this. This causes cancer. We have to ban it. And it's just this immediate everybody piling onto that, and that I think it's disconnected from how farmers operate, and it creates a wider sort of social disconnect from the reality that farmers are dealing with. And the rational way to approach this all is, okay, this has risks. If you ban these things, these other systems that replace them also have risks. So what are the relative risks of those, on both the side of society and the side of the farmers, and then think about, okay, what is the system that we actually want based on all of that consideration? But that's a hard conversation to have. It's not one that goes well on Twitter, So I do think that there is some frustration on the side of the farmers and feeling like they're not understood, and on the side of the consumers of we don't want this, why is this still happening? So there's just, I think, a real disconnect in that sense in some places.
I would second that. My sister's a large commodity farmer, and she got a contract for lentils, and they said she can't put Roundup on them, but she can put paraquat. Yeah, which is way worse, but she didn't want to put on. So, I totally validate that. So building on that, I think part of there's many challenges that farmers face and that consumers face in trying to navigate what to grow and how to grow it and what to buy and from whom. And there's a lot of knowledge gaps, not that the knowledge doesn't exist, but people don't have equitable access to it. So I think a lot of researchers are always trying to find that silver bullet, that new thing. And what we find is there's a lot of solutions out there that work really well, and they're not well socialized, or they're not well applied to the situation at hand. So sort of inequity in access to resources, including knowledge, including land, including capital, including investment, including infrastructure, I would say is the biggest problem. That if we would equalize access to institutional knowledge, if we would equalize access to markets and infrastructure, you might see some better opportunities. A second one I would say, which is part of this, is just the externalization of ecological costs. So if we had a way to value these many things that farmers are producing, like carbon sequestration, like ecological services, like biodiversity, that would be another big input, I think.
Thanks a lot. I will continue with that idea. So I think the most important problem we have is that ecosystem services do not have a price, and the exploitation of natural resources is free, more or less free. So farmers who are exposed to any competition, being it national or international, they react quite reasonably. They abandon best farm practice. That might be different in small societies where there are other arguments, of other contexts which play an important role. But as soon as farmers are under competition, they react in a completely reasonable way, abandoning good farming practice, and we should never blame them for that. Never blame them. And it is especially a problem because we pay a lot for farmers, public money for no public goods, and meaning that Europeans, they subsidize them, but also the United States, they highly subsidize farming with marketing, PR, and so on support. So there, in most countries, there is any kind of subsidy system, and it's never bound to any public goods. And this is the first thing we have to immediately change, and it could be changed. And the second thing is to introduce any tax system making making the use of natural resources no longer free.
Thanks a lot for that. I had a little bit of feeling that you're all saying we shouldn't put the blame on the farmers and we can't ask them to solve these problems for us. But I'm wondering a little bit, like, whether by talking about sustainable farming systems that can deliver livelihoods and treat the soil carefully and produce yields and all of these things, whether we aren't asking farmers in a way to do something that is impossible. Can we actually, is there agriculture that can deliver it all? Or are there fundamental trade-offs that we can't overcome? Are there farming systems that can be equitable to farm workers and farmers, that can have healthy soils, that can be high yielding, because that seems to be a very important criteria for sustainable agriculture, and that can at the same time provide habitats for wildlife, have low impacts on water quality, and have reduced greenhouse gas emissions? Is that actually possible?
Well, I mean, I think Patricio will agree with this one, but there is no farming system that produces food that doesn't have any environmental impact, right? And so it's not that we're going to design the ultimate system that everybody can use that has no impact. That's not possible. But I think, can you design systems that are sustainable and provide all of those services? I think, yes, it's going to look different everywhere. And it also may be that not each individual farmer is going to be able to provide each individual thing. You look at it as a community of farmers, right? Is this farming community and landscape supporting biodiversity rather than putting the burden on each individual farmer? But is this done in such a way that leads to that? It's also, I think, really important to recognize that we can't really design these things, right? You can do some things with policy and so on, but these are individual landowners who own this land, and they're going to manage it the way they want to, and they won't necessarily respond to price incentives. You see all sorts of cases of the farmers just acting against what would be in their direct income advantage because of some cultural preference, and it's their land; they can do what they want. So there's, I think, some limitation to what we can design, and I think we need to be careful about holding out these optimal, idealized things and thinking more in the practicalities.
Can I just build on that? So I totally agree with you. And one of the things that we've observed in our work with farmers, particularly in Brazil, is that it's exactly that. You have to look at farming systems as a community system. A lot of the research that we do is on the plot scale, or it's on the plant scale, and really to understand a sustainable farming system, no farmer acts alone. They're always doing collaborative or competitive marketing, they're sharing resources with their neighbors, they're sharing resources with their surrounding ecosystems. And so institutionally, having incentives to support farm cooperation and to support landscape diversification, I think can lead us towards a sustainable food system. So looking at, the key things being diversification at the community or landscape scale. Some farmers are able to diversify their own farms if they have enough land, but really taking a step back and looking at those bigger pictures, and then looking at how you can sort of support the costs of that so that it is in farmers' best interest and it is in community consumers' best interest. So consumers are really investing in these kind of farming systems. They're supporting groups of farmers, they're supporting cooperative land purchases and that sort of thing. So I think bringing consumers into the equation and not putting it all in the hands of the farmers is really important.
I think it's very important what Allison said. There is no producing food means destroying our ecosystems. So, and so I could have said it in a more positive way, but only to be true, because this is a fight I have very often with organic farmers, because they always think that only conventional farmers have negative environmental costs. It's not true. But there are, of course, differences. And for me, that was one of the most important reasons 30 years ago that I entered the organic research scene, because I saw that organic farmers can have an income by using less polluting farming methods. For me, that was very convincing, because I tried to convince IPM farmers, for instance, to use less pesticide. they all said, oh, it's wonderful what you propose. But unfortunately, we can't do that because we don't get a higher price. And then I saw the organic farmers, and they say, oh, that's very interesting what you said. We will get a higher price because of that. Unfortunately, globally, organic, it's only 1 to 2% of consumers and farmers who are in such a situation. And in many European countries, meanwhile, we have 25% like in Austria. So the willingness is growing, and therefore we should use this unique opportunity, consumers being willing to participate with higher prices in an ecological intensification.
Great ideas. So I just want to say a few remarks, if I may. One is that we are talking about trying to feed the world in the next 30 years, and high food prices is something okay for for people from high-income countries, where we spend maybe 20, 30, 40% of our income on purchasing food. But in places like Sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia, where 90+% of your income will go into buying food, if not more, then a global scenario of higher food prices is just not realistic. Okay, it's not fair, and we should not try to aim for that. It's very risky to do that. We are just going to amplify the difference between low and high-income countries. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that it is true that there is no perfect cropping system. But having said that, there are better systems than others, and there are better farmers than others. So one of the things that I have found to be extremely interesting in trying to stimulate farmers to do better is to allow them to compare their own performance in terms of yield, environmental footprint, input use efficiencies, against other farmers that grow in crops in their neighborhood or in the area or for an area with similar soils and climates. This is like, well, I don't know if in Europe works like that, but in the US, when you get the electricity bill by the end of the month, you can see where you are in the distribution of users. So you can see if you are using a lot of electricity, if you are using very, very little, or you are above average. So just think on farmers doing the same thing. You know, you're a farmer in Nebraska, and you can get like a traffic light signal, like a green, a yellow, or a red, depending how well you are doing for all these different indicators we are talking about. And farmers love that, because farmers love to compare themselves against their neighbors. So let's try to use that behavior to try to promote a positive change in farmers, and constructively bring them to a place where they can produce more, and doing so in a way in which they also minimize their footprint.
Okay, we'll just ask one more question, and then we'll open it out to the audience. So far, I've been reflecting on the fact that the conversation has been on farming, but we could broaden it out and talk about what a sustainable food system looks like. And I was reflecting on the fact that when the plenary was going on, and we had discussions about half Earth, a lot of the questions that came up on Slido, where people were asking about, what about half consumption? Or, are there other ways to think about meeting our goals where we are not just focused on the supply side? So I'd like to hear your thoughts on what a sustainable food system looks like.
Yeah, okay. Well, okay. Yes, of course, we should try to change our habits. I mean, who is against promoting food waste? I mean, let's try to reduce food waste. Let's try to probably move into more vegetarian diets. I'm from Argentina, but I can try, but I mean, nobody can be against that. My only remark there is that we are talking about changing habits. Those things take quite a long time. So if we're talking about a timeline of 30 years to increase our food production by 50%, Well, I mean, I don't know how well that matches with all these solutions that we're talking about. There is one more thing that nobody talks about because it's very politically incorrect, but is population control. But of course, if you talk about population control, then you won't get a job at the United Nations. But there are many things that countries can do in a very constructive way to try to reduce their fertility rates. And that's another way to also reduce the demand for food.
Good point. And I would point to kind of the regional context of this. I think that's important because we've talked a little bit about, I think you look at northern or developed country, we do eat too much meat and we do waste too much food, and both of those things need to be worked on. But where the demand is going to be coming from in the future is not in the U.S. and Europe so much as in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, where they may have still a need to increase their consumption of food, and they may have, I don't actually know their food waste situation, but I imagine it's less than what we do. So I think it's thinking about it in not just a universal context, but in sort of those situational contexts of like what do the different societal actors need to do. And you're right, it is like I've seen there are a lot of now startups who are recovering food waste from the farm, and this initial studies on that showing that actually doesn't really make a difference. It just drives up the price for the good-looking produce that goes to the grocery store, because most of the food is actually wasted out of your refrigerator, right? It's stuff you've already bought and brought home. It's not wasted from the farm to the store. The large majority is in the consumption part. And so it's like, okay, finding out where those points are, and that's really a cultural change for everybody to have to take on, and that does take more time. And the right policy incentives and the right support and all of that for us to make those behavioral changes.
So I'll come back to the equity situation. And when I think about places like Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, and you compare their food systems to, say, Europe or United States, the biggest difference is infrastructure. So we had public investment in food storage silos and railroads and market infrastructure and rural electrification, small-scale food processing, preservation. And so putting those things into place across the whole world would do a lot for global hunger without particularly increasing yield in various places. Having that infrastructure in place allows nutrients to be transported, allows irrigation to be put in, which would vastly increase yield in places that don't have access to this infrastructure. So for me, a sustainable food system isn't necessarily about, I'm like you, I'm agnostic on technology. It's about having people ensured access to that technology if it already exists. And so really basic technology like roads and irrigation systems and food storage facilities and small-scale food processing really can go a long way to achieving global hunger targets without too much research needing to happen.
Thanks a lot. In many developing countries or low-income countries, I've seen silos of cereals molding away. So this is a political problem, a societal problem. It's a lack of good governance, and all our countries in the so-called developed world, we have economic, political relationship with all these countries. So we could help them to develop better governance. This is for sure one thing, and we could also, in our daily work, enable people to take responsibility. This is on a lower level also a way forward. And if we look at many situations, poor people waste as much food as rich people. So so meaning that basically food is not too expensive, food is too cheap, because also as a poor family, I could waste less food and pay a little bit more for the food I eat, and then it wouldn't change my income. So we shouldn't always mention that poor people cannot afford to pay a little bit more for food.
Can I just add one thing to that? A lot, yeah. Organic food isn't always more expensive. Certified organic food in Europe and the USA politically and socially has become more expensive because the market can bear it, but much of the food produced across the globe in low input systems is technically organic, and it's not more expensive. So I think that's sometimes a little bit of a, we don't have really good data to know about non-certified organic systems, to know if that food across the globe is always more expensive. So I just want to be careful about those assumptions.
That's partly a supply chain issue. They have to segregate the supply chain, so.
Okay, awesome. So we would like now to open it up to the audience. Any questions? Do you need the mic or? Yeah.
My question is for Urs. You said that farmers are their natural resources are subsidized, which I agree. Natural resources in agriculture, the cost is externalized. But at the same time, there are some studies which I take the example of India because that's a part of the world that I know more about. There are studies which show that even though farmers have received free electricity in some states, they get subsidized inputs, they are still taxed on the whole because the price of food is kept so low. So that it can be used in the public distribution system. So assuming they are rational, I assume that the farmers would be very happy to sell their food, to not get all the subsidies and sell the food at market price, which is economically viable for them. So on the whole, the subsidies are actually going to the consumers in some regions. So who is actually paying for that natural resource exploitation?
Is that
would you like to add? Yeah. Who should pay if we want to internalize the cost of natural resource exploitation? Who should be paying for it?
I think that there would be, it's really the most challenging for us scientists really to calculate the true cost of food, because this is not as simple as everybody thinks. It's extremely complex. So I doubt, we try to develop that now in different research projects, but I'm not yet clear whether we will succeed. But that's why I always go for a very simple way. I want to tax nitrogen fertilizer companies, and I want to tax pesticide selling companies. That's a very easy way, and it will also we will also tax, for instance, companies which sell to organic farmers, because we also want organic farmers to become less input intensive and more system oriented, ecosystem services, productivity based. Meaning that with such simple methods of taxing those who sell theoretically polluting inputs, that's a very easy way for a solution.
Any further questions? Yeah. Do you need a mic?
Okay. So my question is, what would you do in regions in Europe? So for instance, in the center of Spain, which we observe intensive agriculture like cereals, the soils are already quite polluted. Even water for human consumption is starting to be polluted. So there is, in some villages, it's not possible to consume that water. The landscape is already as well, so intensive agriculture, big plot. What do we do, or what are the policy recommendations or the measures that
No. Why not? Well, I mean, your case sounds very similar to some areas of Nebraska where I live these days. There has been many problems with nitrates in groundwater because of the overuse of fertilizer 30 years ago. But because there is a legacy effect, we are now paying for what we did wrong 30 years ago. So we cannot change that, but we can change the trajectory looking forward. And it's very simple. I mean, you need to work with farmers and let them know that when they are losing nitrogen, they're actually losing money, because pollution means money that farmers are losing. So if you build that case, then you get more receptive. I mean, farmers get way more receptive to the idea of reducing the environmental footprint, not because of love for society as a broad, but because it's a way also to increase their net income. So in the case of Nebraska, we work a lot in showing farmers what they can do in terms of reducing their nitrogen balance. So we do very simple calculations to see how much nitrogen is removed from the field through grain versus how much is input into the field through fertilizer. If they are around zero, that means that's good because it means that the system is operating near balance. But if you see a field where you have a nitrogen surplus greater than 75 kilos per nitrogen, well, that means problems because we know that those fields will likely have high nitrogen losses. But having said that, there are other farmers that are doing good. So it will be very unfair to put all the farmers on the same bag and to say that they are polluting the environment. So I believe that having some simple metrics like the nitrogen balance or the yield gap can help us to understand how farmers are doing and eventually what they can do to do better into the future. But there are many things that can be done through very, very simple agronomy. We don't need to reinvent the wheel.
Awesome, thank you.
Farmers getting excited, and agency in terms of let's ask the farmers what data would actually be useful, what research would actually be useful. I wanted to ask you to think about what else can we do to turn this more in this direction and give farmers more agency. So some of the things might be reducing risk, allowing them to actually take risks to try out new things and have some sort of safety net that if those fail, it will be okay. And another thing that I've heard a lot in my conversations with farmers is there's so many layers of regulations that there's just not a lot of wiggle room. There's not a lot of options. And that actually, well, in Switzerland, it was not possible to even meet all the regulations because if you met one, you would automatically conflict with another. So how can we empower the farmers to do a lot of this on their own instead of us telling them how to solve the problem?
I'll answer this, kind of my day job. So the approach that we have taken is kind of building on what Patricio was talking about, which is start measuring, right? Start measuring indicators of the environmental impact is what we're looking at. But whatever it is your concern, benchmark. Where are you now? Can you do better? Work with your local experts to figure out if you can do better. And responding to this comparison across farmers, you can anonymize the results and look, and you see, they respond really well to the, oh my gosh, I use twice as much nitrogen as these guys next to me. That means I wasted this many dollars, right? So you can start to see that, but you have to go into the community and work with them and help educate them on their terms. And so our organization's approach is to work with the advisors who are already there in the field. Don't send in new people. Go to the people who already work with the farmers and work with them to see what kind of information can be provided to help, measure, actually show them where they are. We experienced this recently with doing some water quality modeling with some farmers. Like they know there's nitrogen problems. They understand that, but they don't see it in the water coming off their field. And we actually modeled for them, here is the nitrogen you've lost from your field. If you hadn't done these practices, this is the nitrogen you would have lost. And they really responded well to the idea of, okay, I can actually see impact in this modeling, and so find that kind of thing really powerful. So, it's just meeting them where they are, I think, is the place to start.
Yeah, I think I would totally support what you're saying, and I think a lot of farmers feel really alone. They're especially in North America, countrysides have emptied out. People don't have a lot of solidarity. It's been a bit of a competitive divide and conquer kind of model. And I think getting more young people into farming is a big piece of this agency that farmers they don't feel like there's a future. And so their children have left the farm. And this is happening in Latin America. It's happening in lots of places that are rapidly urbanizing. So if you look globally at what is keeping farmers on the land and continuing to practice traditional agriculture or continuing to do diversification or continuing to do agroforestry, it's their place attachment. It's like getting a community together that supports each other, getting a cooperative farming association going, getting a fair trade network going. So it's actually that social connection that gives them collective agency to secure their future, whereas an individual farmer sort of trying to compete at a market sometimes can't do it on their own. Yeah.
More questions on the side.
Thank you for the session, and I would like to kind of raise a more pessimistic perspective. And for some, it's clear that the time playing a key role, as Dr. Grassini says. But on the other side, we have to provide sustainable solution that would also hold over time. So if we kind of over-intensify over time, we may have a problem in the future. Then remove kind of barrier, structural, and economic, different economic and policy barriers, structural barriers that promote kind of widespread changes of how agriculture is being made, promoting health, building farming systems, kind of widespread, would take too much time. So my question would be, for who wants to answer, do you really think that we can actually feed everybody?
Well, hopefully yes. I mean, I cannot predict the future, but the question is how you want to do it and at which price. You want to do that by cutting down all our forests, or you want to do that by intensifying? So it's up to us to decide which pathway we want to go. Having said that, there is something that as researchers, I believe that we should be a little bit more critical. And also the private sector, why not? Historically, the way we have been doing research is by looking into single components of a cropping system. So we make investments into trying to find the best seeds or the best fertilizer or the best pesticides, but there has been very little investments in research that try to put all the components of the cropping systems together and to make it viable and to comply with all those environmental and productivity goals that we are talking about. So I think that there is a lot to do in terms of resetting our priorities and to start to invest more into cropping system research, not just into specific components that alone by itself, they won't be the silver bullet taking care of all the problems.
I think we can absolutely feed everybody. I mean, there's more calories on the earth today than are needed to feed everybody. A more than healthy diet, they're poorly distributed. And Patricio's right, that our cropping systems research doesn't tend to look at food systems as systems. It looks at them as, one seed, one crop, one piece of DNA even. So the extent to which we can look at food systems as a system and look at the farm scale, look at the landscape scale, look at the regional scale, and try to understand what are those structural drivers that connect these different components, and where are the, what the IPS food organization calls lock-ins and leverage points. They've identified very clear lock-ins that many communities face, and that there are very clear leverage points that would maybe redirect those pathways towards more sustainable food systems. So all of those require interdisciplinary work. They require communities to work with researchers and governments to actually shift those systems towards ways of growing food and ways of producing food and ways of distributing and consuming food that are healthier. But no one sector can do it by itself.
Well, yeah, my slide is still up. Soil health does that too, right? So that actually does increase the nutrient content of the grains. I've seen that. You get more micronutrients in the grains coming from healthy soil ecosystems. That's not the full answer, though, right? Obviously, you're looking for more diversified diet, right? We can't just eat corn and soy and wheat and rice, all day, every day, and be happy people, right? You need diversification. You need to have the fruits and vegetables, and I think that is a somewhat of a challenge. I think the land-based, I think we all focus on like the land aspect, or at least I do. It's like, where is all the land? And it's all in the big crops that are producing in the large volumes. But I think that is a challenge, is, we don't necessarily want everybody to just be eating these highly processed foods, right? You want to be diversified. I don't have the solution to that. If anybody else does, please speak up.
Yeah, sure.
I think it's a very interesting thought, because the dominant, predominant narrative of science and of policy is the efficiency narrative. And meanwhile, I'm 100% convinced that this will lead us into the completely wrong direction, exactly as you have mentioned. And that's why, for instance, when for the EU Commission, when we had a high-level steering board for the European Partnership for Sustainability and Productivity and Sustainability, and there we developed two narratives. One was the efficiency narrative, and one was the sufficiency narrative. And there is no way that we talk about that. No way. And I'm convinced that there we will find a solution.
Yeah, I think that looking at land use and what it's allocated for is very, very important. The Eat Lancet report just talked about the planetary diet, and it would require a large shift away from as many grain and fodder crops and moving it towards fruits, vegetables, tree nuts, that sort of thing, increasing our fish production with land-based aquaculture even. So I think, a lot of our research dollars do go into large-scale commodity systems, and I think shifting to see how you can intercrop in those systems, to see how you can, within farms, actually do more alternative crops. What the USDA calls fruit and vegetable specialty crops, which I just think is hilarious. They're our most nutritious crops. They shouldn't be a specialty crop. They should be our mainstays. So even just changing the way that our governance frameworks talk about the food that we grow as food rather than commodities would be a huge shift.
Can I add something?
Go ahead.
Yes. First of all, in the US, we grow maize in rotation with soybeans, so we produce carbs, oil, and protein. And then California is one of the major fruit and vegetables producing states. So, you go to the supermarket and you can find whatever you want to eat. So it's up to the consumer to decide what to eat. But having said that, there are good reasons why human diet rely mostly on four commodity crops, which are soybean, wheat, rice, and maize. It's not just because we love them and that's it. It's because these crops have grains that have very high caloric or even protein content per unit of mass. You can dry them out, so it's easy to transport them. It's much cheaper. It takes less fuel. In developing countries, if you want to cook them, it will take you less firewood, to prepare your food. And one more thing, these crops have been improved for broad adaptation over the past 100 years, so they can easily grow across a wide range of environments. So there are many reasons why our diet depends mostly on these four crops. It's not just because we hate the others. So I have nothing against new crops or into diversifying our diet. That would be great. But let's not forget why we ended up relying so heavily into those four crops. So I will simply ask, what's the alternative that you propose?
I would let him answer that.
Number one, I would remove subsidies from corporate agriculture in the developed world. That's the first thing. If we look at the small farm sector, it barely has an impact. When we go to Africa, there are huge tracts of land, and then there's 10 meters on the side of the road with small farmers. There's our small farms that we see. But there are giant subsidies going to these corporations. We could tax these corporations. You see, Syngenta was able to even, European Union didn't want them to come lobby, but they weren't able to have that much power over Syngenta. They were able to get that. So I think there's a lot that can be done to start re-subsidizing these corporations.
So I'll just respond to that quickly. We're not locked into a concrete system. Our system is always changing. And so the system we have today is not going to get us out of that problem. We have to create the system that we want to see. And you can create that system in a sort of radical, revolutionary way, like by, getting rid of capitalism tomorrow, which is kind of difficult. Or you can try for that on the one hand, and then you can also, in a rhizomatic way, through very diversified campaigns and movements and groups of people and groups of researchers and communities, kind of work for solutions in those, what they call the interstitial cracks in the failing system. So you actually grow new roots out of that failure. And there's a lot of knowledge in the room, and there's a lot of knowledge in the world, and a lot of people wanting to do that. The system that we have isn't permanent, and it never will be. So I think, we can change it.
Yeah. So full disclosure, so the organization I work for gets our funding from its members, and there are 140 of those, including Syngenta and Bayer and other companies like that. So, I have to get that off my chest. No, so, and I would say, I wouldn't look at these as monoliths that are hell-bent on destroying the world for a profit. I think they would agree with you that the world is changing, and they want to be responding to that change in a way that they can stay in business, right? So they are also interested in sustainability of their business. But destroying, our farmland is going to put them out of business. And so I think, one thing we are seeing now is movement towards more data services in agriculture, and those companies moving towards serving farmers advice and data and tools as opposed to products. So you see them already shifting into selling conservation services. So it's not that I don't know that we have to blow the whole system up and start over. It's like you can start doing some changes within the system, and these companies are, in fact, interested in changing along with everything else because they see that, they do need to stay in business, and I think everybody recognizes the current system is not fully sustainable over the long term. There's too many challenges coming up.
I think, of course, everybody is agreeing on what you have been saying and how you have described the entire development. And this entire development has enabled the urbanization of our societies. And it will be the driver for further urbanization. So everything is really very linked with each other, and we also have to think about that, how society as a whole will develop. I'm more on the practical level, and I'm looking for solutions, and the older I get, the more I prefer simple solution, because I don't have enough time for another 60 years to think about complex research and complex solutions. So for me, as a policy maker, I would do one thing. I would immediately ban reactive nitrogen, because we have pumped into our agroecosystems, or in our ecosystems, so incredibly masses of reactive nitrogen via Haber-Bosch synthesis. And so we are in a situation where we can continue in recycling this biomass we produce for another 100 years without losing a lot of productivity. But at the moment, we continue to pump more reactive nitrogen into the ecosystems. That should be immediately stopped. And then farmers have the liberty, again, the free decision to go for crop rotation, to grow leguminous crops, to establish circular economy, and each farmer can choose what he wants. One farmer will re-establish livestock on his arable farm, so we wouldn't need a lot of regulation. It is one decision to ban it, and then everything would partly fall back into place, and many problems would become solved. It's a very simple solution, but it's a very effective one.
I would have to disagree with that. But we don't need to go into too much detail, I think. Oh, there's the political challenge of that. I think it's a little bit too, certainly for the U.S. and our political context, even in our most liberal phases, that's not going to happen. But also, I think if you did that overnight, you would have definitely severe production problems. So it's not, we have to look at this change. You know, as Patricio said, we have 30 years. People think that's a lot of time, right? But it actually takes time to achieve change in these systems. You can't just do something like that, ban anything overnight and expect the system to respond. Farmers are planning multiple years ahead. You have to give them a lot of time. If you're going to start even regulating and cutting back on the nitrogen they can add, they have to be able to plan ahead, and that's going to be a transition that takes more than a decade. You know, so we have to think about that time context as well.
Okay, so because we're nearing the end, and I'm sure that you're all also eager to get some food into your bellies, even though there's many, many, many more interesting questions that we could be discussing here. I would like to finish this panel today with a short concluding statement from all of you about what would the farming system of the future that you envision, that you desire, look like, and maybe if you could name one leverage point that you think would be important for us to get there.
Again, me first? Right, no problem. So, good news is that agronomy never received so much attention as nowadays. That's good for our generation of young, well, maybe not me, but for the generation of young agronomists, because agronomy is back on the table for discussion. And there is increasingly pressure for farming systems to produce more nutritious food and doing so in a way in which is more environmentally friendly. There is no other way to save our beautiful forests, wetlands, peatlands, if we are not able to feed the world in extinct cropland area. Remember that every year we are bringing 13 million hectares of land into crop production. Okay? So we are not doing good. So the question is, what are we going to do different in the future to make sure that we slow down that increase in cropland area that takes place every year, and at the same time making sure that while producing more on our extinct cropland area, we do it in a way in which we reduce environmental footprint. To me, the way to do that is by accelerating the rate at which we discover the new technologies, the new managements that can allow farmers to reach those targets. But also to reach those targets, we need to provide farmers with those targets, you know. Where do we want farmers to be, okay? So that's a fair question that we should ask ourselves as a society. Where do we want farmers to be? Because if we are not able to convey 5 or 6 bullet points, you know, asking farmers, telling farmers, this is what we would like to see in your farms, then the discussion is going to become very broad and very complex, and will create immobilization. And in 30 years down the road, we are going to be regretting because we didn't take the right actions, the right interventions at the right time. So I just want to finalize with a positive message, you know, that this is a great moment to be a young scientist because you can contribute to solve this problem and this challenge. So it's a great moment to be a good scientist, and make sure to get involved.
Yay. Great. I'll build a little bit on that. So when I think about this, you see the 2050 target, but you also think these are systems that have to sustain beyond that, right? Population. It's not just feeding everybody in 2050, it's 2055 and 2060 and beyond. So the sustainable system needs to be something that will be sustainable beyond that as well. And I'm going to actually go to something that's not my field at all, back to the agency part of this. To me, is sustainable system. It's going to look physically different and technologically different everywhere, right? Because everywhere is dealing with different histories and social and cultural and environmental challenges and opportunities, but really one where farmers have options and tools to farm the way that they want, the way that they feel is productive to them and meets their needs as well as those of society. So I think that's a key important part to it in terms of some things that we can do to get there. I think, again, working with them, helping them tie into the science and the understanding better the impacts that are somewhat intangible that they can't see. Can we, as scientists, as a scientific community, help them see that so that they can make more informed decisions?
Great. So building on that, what I see as the ideal food system in the future is a diverse one. Exactly, that farmers have options on how to produce, that they're producing a large variety of different kinds of crops and foods that are foods for people, and they're based on the principle of soil health, and that land can continue to regenerate the nutritious plate that all people of the world need to eat. And so, in my view, one of the biggest leverage points to get there is to harness the power of the eaters, that we have all of these eaters throughout the world who are facing huge chronic health, diet-related disease problems, who are facing sort of the neoliberal nutrition transition, which has taken people away from their food cultures, and they don't have access to those anymore. And they're coming to the countryside, and they're making relationships with farmers and sort of supporting them towards this kind of transitional agriculture. And so I think the more that we can understand, again, looking at a food systems approach, the relationships between production decisions and marketing options and sort of consumer preferences, connecting those rather than having them be isolated spheres of research could be really helpful.
The only thing I can do now is come up with a second very simple proposal. So I would tax herbicides tenfold of the price, because billions of smallholder farmers all over the world, and also big acre organic farmers all over the world, show that herbicides do not have nothing to do with productivity. And it's other factors which reduce in the productivity. So, and then farmers would immediately start to adapt crop rotation, farm techniques, and so on and so on.
Okay, so thank you very much to all four of you for your really interesting perspectives and diverse perspectives on this topic, and also opposing and controversial perspectives. And thank you all for being here. And yeah,
See you at dinner.
exactly. See you at dinner, and let's enjoy some good food.